We're continuing with our events and parent-child communication. And we've seen the pattern child to parent. In this next example, we've got a parent where child communicates with the parent then sets new attributes on the child O2. We're also going to see an example of how when the child is clicked, that actually it can access a public method or any method on this class because it's just JavaScript. Just as an example, not that this is a particular design pattern, but that it is possible. So let's go into the page. It's child parent here, number 20, and we have these two scripts. So let's close these two down. Let's open up. And if we open this up, let's just have a look to see what it's going on in the page. So we've got two components, component 1, component 2. This is an output container. This is just some text information here. When we click on this, we see that we had some information. This is component 1. We get it from the parent and it updates the page. But we've also been able to fire an event directly from here to change a value in the component. Pardon me, when we've clicked on this, we've actually then, the parent will then change this component here. But if we look in the events, we can see actually that we can fire a public method on component 2. So if we refresh the page, when this clicks, it sends an event up to the parent. That changes the attributes on this component. So it changes this setting here, and it also outputs something to the page. But this also fires this component 2 method, a public or just a method on this component in a sibling to sibling manner. For example, it's accessing it here. So if we have a look at the code, that'll become a little bit more easier to understand. We have our parent container here, and we have our two web components, child 1, child 2, and the output area that we've seen before here. What we're doing is we're listening at the container level, not on the component this time, but at the parent level, although you could do it at component 1. And basically what we're doing is we're listening for the child 1 click event, which is an event that is dispatched by component 1 when it is clicked. So when it is clicked, we've seen this before, it actually then is going to set the attribute on child 2. That's how we see that new number being formed. But we'll also find the component 2 public method, and that is in the child 2 component. If we come down here, I've added a public method. It's just a method. There's no difference between public and private methods in JavaScript at this time, but just calling it public, and you can see it's just consoling log out something. So this is sibling to sibling connection. It is possible, it's your application, but the design pattern for web components is parents to children through props, children to parents through events, and children to children through their parent. So coming back now, we can begin to see this. Then we also have an event listener for when the second button is clicked, and it's doing something similar as well. It's updating content. So if we come back here and refresh the page, we click on this, that goes up to the parent, that sets a new attribute for this, the value here, which then re-renders. The parent then displays some information on the page from the payload that it got from component 1. And component 1 also accesses the public method or a method on the component of component 2, and it gets displayed here. So when you work through the code, you'll be able to see that sort of pattern. It's all documented here. But essentially we're firing events from here, going to the parent's then changing attributes on a component below. It's also outputting information to the page. This component can access directly this component here. Not a design practice, but we can do that. And then when this is clicked, that too sends a message up to the parent. The payload is then displayed down here. So if we look at this, the type is child 2 click. The payload was type 2 here, which is down there. So these examples basically summarize props and events. And we've seen examples of all of these different types of communications in this chapter. The last one is using setters and getters. And if we open this up, This is just doing a fetch API request, but if we look at the code, what's happening in here is we're actually using the setter and getter functions to change attribute names. But to be careful, there is a design pattern that one can be warned that if you're listening to attributes with the attribute change callback, but you're also setting and getting, you will end up finding that you'll get an endless loop, and that's documented here. Google has identified this pattern. So generally setters and getters aren't used within maybe the same component, but with, if you wanted to set and get on a different component, although we don't do child to child, sibling to sibling connection. So there's an example in here of how you can just use the setter to change properties within the component using the setters and getter static methods. But if you do that, don't use attribute change callback. And what's actually considered the best practice is that attributes are the source of all truth about the properties of a component. So when we index here, this would now be the source of all truth. This is responsible for changing things through attribute change callback, not through setters and getters, but it is a possibility. So that concludes section 5. Maybe a little bit tricky going through all these setters and getters and change, but if you play with this, you'll probably crash your browser. And a good example of to see why we don't use that method. So that's the end of the O5 event sections. We're going to proceed on now to the library and actually see the applications and the different components.